July 10, 1942. Akutan Island, Alaska Territory. Mechanic Albert Knack peered through the observation window of the Catalina patrol plane. His binoculars trembled slightly in his hands. His heartbeat quickened. What he saw lying in the swamp below was almost impossible to believe. On the wing gleamed a red circle, the rising sun. Every American pilot knew what that meant. It was the mark of Japan and of the most feared aircraft in the Pacific. There, upside down in the wet grass, lay a Japanese Zero fighter. It looked almost completely intact. Lieutenant William Tice, the pilot of the patrol plane, had gotten lost in the Aleutian fog. Navigating by dead reckoning, he had chosen a rarely flown route, a straight line from Akutan Island to Dutch Harbor. No one could have guessed that this obscure route would change the entire course of the Pacific War. Knack thought he must be seeing things. How could a Japanese pilot have left behind such a treasure? For more than a year, this aircraft had been a nightmare across the Pacific skies. This mysterious weapon could easily defeat American, British, and Chinese planes alike. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, across Burma and Malaya, the Zero had achieved the impossible, a carrier-based fighter outperforming land-based interceptors. Circling the crash site 3 times, Lieutenant Tice carefully marked its position on the chart. Neither man could have known then that historians would later call this discovery a priceless find. What they were about to recover would expose the deepest contradiction in aircraft design during World War II, a contradiction not written in any technical manual, but in the blood of those saved, and in the victories that followed. For 7 months after Pearl Harbor, the legend of the Zero grew from fear and awe. American pilots had encountered something that shattered their understanding of air combat. A fighter faster, more agile, and with far greater range. One that ruled the Pacific skies. In China, early encounters between the Zero and Soviet-made planes produced a kill ratio of 12-1. In April 1942, a Japanese formation of 36 Zeros attacked Ceylon, shooting down 27 British aircraft and losing only 5 of their own. Official American doctrine soon became humiliatingly simple. If you see a Zero run, avoid combat, never dogfight. These orders weren't born of cowardice, but of hard, bloody statistics. Those who tried traditional tactics against the Zero rarely lived to report their mistake. June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway. 1,500 miles to the north, the Japanese launched a diversionary raid on the Aleutians, hoping to draw American attention away. 19-year-old Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga took off from the carrier Ryujo as part of the second wave striking Dutch Harbor. His Zero, tail number 4593, belonged to a 3-plane unit assigned to strafe the U.S. Naval base on the Alaskan Islands. Koga and his wingmen, Ensigns Endo and Matsuda, dove toward the harbor, shooting down an American PBY Catalina and strafing the survivors in the water. But during the attack, ground fire struck Koga's aircraft. A bullet severed an oil line. The damage wasn't instantly fatal, but within minutes it would be. Precious oil sprayed into the cold Alaskan air. 25 miles east of Dutch Harbor lay Akutan Island, chosen beforehand by the Japanese as an emergency landing site. A submarine waited offshore to rescue any downed pilots. When his oil pressure dropped, Koga signaled his wingmen and turned toward Akutan. From above, the grassland looked flat and perfect. Half a mile inland from Broad Bay, seemed solid, inviting, safe. Circling overhead, Matsuda suddenly noticed a shimmer of water among the grass. Horror struck him. It wasn't solid ground at all, but swamp. He tried desperately to signal Koga, urging him to belly land, but it was too late. Koga had already lowered his landing gear for a normal approach. The Zero's wheels touched down and immediately sank deep into the mud. The aircraft pitched forward violently, flipped over, and came to rest upside down. The wings and fuselage were nearly undamaged, but inside the inverted cockpit, Tadayoshi Koga was killed instantly, his neck broken by the impact. His comrades circled helplessly above the wreckage, torn between duty and despair. Every Japanese pilot had been given a clear order. If a Zero crashed on enemy soil, it must be destroyed. The secrets of that plane were too important, its performance too critical, could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. But Koga might still be alive. They could not bring themselves to strafe one of their own. After several agonizing circles, fuel ran low and the weather worsened. They turned west and headed back to the carrier, certain a Japanese submarine would soon rescue Koga. The submarine searched for hours but was driven off by the U.S. destroyer Williamson. Koga's body remained in the cockpit. The Zero lay quietly in the marsh. There were no regular air routes over that spot. The Americans had no idea this plane existed. A month passed. Fog and rain hid the prize. Then, through a gap in the clouds, Albert Nack saw what looked like a small aircraft. On July 11th, Lieutenant Tice returned with a landing party. They approached the overturned fighter cautiously, weapons ready, unsure what they would find. Naval flyer William Scarborough, an experienced member of the salvage crew, waded through the marsh to the plane and peered into the cockpit. Koga's body was still strapped into the pilot's seat. The recovery men stood quietly, studying the aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific and terrified American pilots. Even upside down and damaged, the Zero retained a predator-like grace. Its streamlined shape bore almost no protrusions. The whole design radiated speed and agility. They photographed it from every angle before beginning recovery work. Koga's body was removed and buried nearby with Christian rites. Whatever the politics between nations, he was a soldier deserving of respect. Then the real work began. The salvage crew examined the Zero's structure and recorded every detail. Their initial observations in those first hours proved as important as the later test flights. The aircraft was astonishingly light, not just in total weight but in the weight of every component. The skin felt thin, almost fragile. Scarborough tapped the fuselage and heard a hollow sound that reminded him of a tin can, not a fighting plane. He searched for armor plates around the cockpit and found none. He looked for bulletproof glass in the windshield and found ordinary transparent panels. He inspected the fuel tank and found a simple aluminum container with no self-sealing capability. This contradicted everything American designers believed about fighter construction. Modern fighters were increasingly armored. Armor behind the pilot's seat, bulletproof windshields, fuel tanks with rubber bladders that would swell and seal when punctured. These protections added weight but saved pilots' lives. The Zero had none of them. Recovery attempts failed twice. The Aleutians were notorious for sudden storms and impenetrable fog. On July 12, Lieutenant Robert Kems led the salvage team in a formal Christian burial for Koga, replacing the hasty grave dug the day before. They tried again to recover the plane, but a transport vessel dragged its anchor in the foul weather. Finally, on July 15th, a barge reached the site. Mechanics used ropes and pulleys to right the aircraft and carefully hoisted it onto the barge. Despite having soaked in the marsh for 5 weeks, the Zero's structure was remarkably intact. The airframe had not warped, and the skin showed little corrosion. The salvage crew took the Zero to Dutch Harbor and washed the swamp mud from it. Over the next few days they assessed the damage. Bent propeller blades that needed replacement, twisted landing gear, slight tail damage, but the ailerons, rudder, and elevators all moved. The engine surfaces looked sound. The plane might be reparable. To move an intact enemy fighter from Alaska to California required absolute secrecy. Japanese spies were reported along the west coast. If they learned the U.S. possessed a complete Zero, they might take extreme measures to destroy it. On July 25th, the Zero was covered tightly in tarpaulins and loaded onto a barge bound for Seattle. From Seattle, it was transferred to a flat car and disguised as ordinary cargo for the trip across the west to San Diego. At San Diego, it was taken to North Island Naval Air Station, where the real work would begin. North Island mechanics treated the Zero like a fragile work of art. They painstakingly disassembled and cleaned it, inspecting every component. They replaced the propeller with a spare from U.S. stock, similar in size and capable of mating with the Zero's power plant, and repaired the landing gear and tail control surfaces. The real challenge was the engine. The Nakajima Sakai 12, A new 14-cylinder, air-cooled motor rated at about 940 horsepower was the heart of the Zero. The mechanics spent days testing every cylinder, every line, every connection. The engine's construction was simpler than comparable American power plants. Fewer parts, easier to manufacture, yet no less precise. They tightened fittings, replaced hoses, cleaned the carburetor, and inspected the ignition system. By late August, they judged the Zero airworthy for a test flight. The question was, who would fly it? Who would dare climb into the cockpit of this mysterious enemy machine? They chose Navy Major Frederick Sanders. Why him? Sanders had flown nearly every frontline American fighter in service. He had tested new designs, evaluated foreign types, and written detailed technical reports. He knew how to get an unfamiliar airplane airborne and still live to tell what it felt like. More important, he knew tactics. He had combat experience in the Pacific and had faced Zeros in action. He knew what questions to ask and which characteristics to examine. On the morning of 20 September 1942, Sanders climbed into the Zero's cockpit. The Japanese markings on the fuselage had been painted over and replaced with American stars, but the cockpit placards remained in Japanese. He studied the controls while the mechanics, using a translated manual, explained each switch and lever. The throttle was on the left like American planes. The mixture control was adjacent. Trim for ailerons, rudder, and elevator were all labeled in Japanese. The instrument dials were metric. The altimeter read in meters, not feet. The airspeed indicator read kilometers per hour, not miles per hour. Sanders had to keep mental conversions of speed and altitude while flying an enemy machine whose behavior he did not yet understand. He started the Nakajima Sakai. The engine came to life with a steady, powerful note. Sanders warmed it and watched the gauges. Oil pressure normal, oil temperature rising, all needles in the green. He signaled the ground crew, released the chocks, and eased the throttle forward. Like all tail draggers, ground visibility was poor. Sanders did S-turns to see ahead. At the runway end, he aligned with the centerline, rechecked systems, took a deep breath, and pushed the throttle smoothly to full. The Zero leapt from the runway. Acceleration was astonishing. Takeoff roll shockingly short. Sanders had never flown a plane that became airborne so effortlessly. He retracted the gear and began the climb. The rate of climb stunned him. 3,000 feet per minute. The best American fighters of the time managed only about half that. The Zero did not merely climb. It seemed to rocket upward. The sky felt as if gravity had been loosened. At 10,000 feet, he began control checks. A gentle input on the stick produced an immediate reaction. Ailerons were crisp, the rudder precise. Control response was not progressive but instantaneous. A light touch and the airplane moved. He began turns, gentle, then steeper, then into hard, sustained turns. The Zero circled with almost no loss of altitude. Its turn radius, astonishingly small, made Sanders understand why American pilots had feared it. Maneuvers that took thousands of feet in U.S. fighters were done in mere hundreds by the Zero. It could tighten, climb faster, and respond quicker. Trying to turn fight with it was suicidal. But Sanders had come to find weakness, not admire strengths. He pushed the airspeed and put the Zero into a high-speed dive to accelerate. 160, 180, 200, 220 mph and higher. As speed rose, he noticed the ailerons beginning to stiffen. By 240 mph, the ailerons were almost immovable. He had to muscle the stick to achieve roll. There it was, a vulnerability at high speed. The ailerons would freeze and rolling became difficult. Sanders eased back to cruise and ran through a series of aerobatic checks, rolls, barrel rolls, half-roll reversals, then tried a negative G maneuver, pushing the stick forward. He briefly put the aircraft into a zero-G dive. The engine hiccuped, then died. Sanders felt his heart skip a beat. An engine out in an enemy fighter 10,000 feet up. He steadied himself, waited a second. The engine restarted and returned to normal. He tried the negative G maneuver again. The engine died once more, then restarted. Weakness number 2. Under negative G, the Zero's engine would cut out. It was a problem with the flow-type carburetor. American fighters used pressure carburetors that worked in any attitude. The Zero used the simpler, cheaper float carburetor that relied on gravity to feed fuel. Under -G, the fuel drained away from the carburetor and the engine stalled. After landing, Sanders wrote a detailed report that spread through naval aviation like electricity. At high speed, the Zero could not roll easily. If an American pilot could push the speed above about 240 miles per hour, he could roll away and the Zero could not follow. Under -G, the Zero's engine would cut out. American pilots could push the stick forward into a -G dive. The Zero would stall and the American aircraft would keep flying. These were not theoretical weaknesses but practical tactics that could save lives. In the months that followed, more pilots test flew the captured Zero. Each returned with new observations, fresh data, and deeper insights. They tested stall behavior and found the Zero's stall mild and easy to recover from. They tested dive performance and discovered the control problems at high speed were worse than the first reports had indicated. They tested range and found the Zero astonishingly fuel efficient. Most important, they tested combat tactics. The Navy organized mock fights. The Zero against the best American fighters, Wildcat, Avenger, Lightning, and pilots learned which maneuvers worked and which were fatal. Never turn fight a Zero, it will win. Exploit American planes' superior diving speed. The Zero cannot follow in a high-speed dive. Use boom and zoom tactics. Dive to attack, then climb away. Do not stay in a turning engagement. Use -G maneuvers. Push the stick forward into -G and the Zero's engine will quit. If a Zero is on your tail, push into a full-throttle dive and violently roll. At high speed it cannot follow. These tactics were practiced repeatedly against a real Zero. By the time American pilots faced the enemy in the Pacific, they already knew what to do. The most shocking lesson from the captured Zero was not just its performance but its design philosophy. American engineers saw a series of deliberate choices. Each one favored performance over protection. No armor meant lightweight, but any hit could be fatal. No self-sealing fuel tanks meant long range, but any damage could cause fire or explosion. A float carburetor meant simple construction, but engine failure under -G. A lightweight airframe meant great maneuverability, but limited structural margins at high speed. Every design decision reflected a fundamental principle. Prioritize offensive performance over pilot survivability. The Zero was not built to protect its pilot, but to allow him to shoot down enemies. Japanese designers assumed the war would be short and decisive. They assumed pilot skill would avoid hits. They placed attack performance above protection. In 1941, those assumptions made sense. Experienced Japanese pilots, superbly trained and flying a high-performance fighter, dominated early battles. They didn't need armor because they expected not to be hit. They didn't need rugged structure because they could avoid damage. But the war did not end quickly. It dragged on. Veteran pilots were killed and replaced by less experienced men. The U.S. began building better fighters and learning tactics based on what they'd learned from the Zero. The balance began to tip. By mid-1943, the Zero's shortcomings became deadly. American pilots knew how to avoid the Zero's advantages and exploit its weaknesses. More important, American engineers had absorbed those lessons and put them into new designs. The F-6F Hellcat was a textbook response, built specifically to defeat the Zero. Heavier, tougher, and armored, the Hellcat sacrificed some maneuverability and didn't need it. It fought with diving attacks and energy tactics, using speed and firepower to overcome agility. Most crucially, the Hellcat brought its pilots home. Armor absorbed hits that would have killed a Zero pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. Reinforced structures absorbed damage that would have destroyed other aircraft. Hellcat pilots survived combat, gaining experience and becoming more effective. Zero pilots, by contrast, died. Even minor damage was often fatal because they had no protection. By 1944, nearly all experienced Japanese pilots were gone. Inexperienced recruits flying aging Zeros faced seasoned American pilots in superior aircraft. The result was a one-sided massacre. The impact of the Akutan Zero went far beyond the technical study of a single plane. It transformed America's understanding of Japanese air power, reshaped tactical training, and redefined design priorities. Before its capture, America knew almost nothing about how to defeat the Zero. Pilots knew it was fast, agile, and deadly, nothing more. They didn't know its weaknesses because no one had examined one up close. After Akutan, everything changed. American pilots now knew the Zero couldn't roll effectively above 240 knots. They knew its engine cut out under -G. They knew it lacked armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and protection. That knowledge became tactics. Tactics became training. Training saved lives. Marine pilots over Guadalcanal, Navy pilots at Santa Cruz, Army pilots in New Guinea, all applied those lessons. They survived encounters they should have lost, returned to base, and fought again. Their experience accumulated, their skill grew, and slowly the balance of power shifted. The captured Zero also influenced Japan's strategy. When Japanese intelligence learned that America had recovered an intact Zero, they were stunned. They knew what it meant. Their frontline fighters' secrets were exposed. American pilots would soon learn how to defeat it. The psychological edge of the once invincible Zero vanished overnight. Japanese planners began designing replacement fighters, but development took years and required resources Japan no longer had. The Zero had to remain in service, growing more obsolete each month. By the time replacements arrived, they were too few and too late. The capture of the Akutan Zero accelerated Japan's defeat by years. Its weaknesses were exposed early, weaknesses that otherwise would have taken countless lives and months of combat to reveal. In the end, the most shocking discovery about the Zero wasn't its ability, it was its fragility. American expectations, shaped by propaganda and fear, imagined a superweapon, an invincible aircraft built by a mysterious enemy. What they found instead was a superb offensive machine with fatal design flaws. No armor, even light damage proved deadly. No self-sealing tanks, fuel fires, and explosions. A float-type carburetor, engine failure under -G. High-speed stiffness, loss of roll control in combat dives. Every weakness was the price of a chosen strength. Agility at the cost of protection. Range at the cost of ruggedness. Lightness at the cost of survival. American designers made different choices because they had different priorities and greater industrial capacity. Pilot survival came first. Planes could be replaced, trained pilots could not. So armor was worth the wait if it brought a pilot home. Self-sealing tanks were mandatory, even if they reduced fuel capacity. A strong airframe was essential, even if it meant slightly lower performance. Those choices reflected American industrial and cultural values. America had the factories to build more planes and the schools to train more pilots. They could afford heavier, more expensive aircraft if it meant saving lives. Japan could not. Limited industry demanded simplicity. Light, quickly built aircraft. What made sense for a short war proved disastrous in a long one. The story of the Akutan Zero became more than a war tale. It became a case study in design philosophy, cultural values, and strategic thinking. Every airplane reveals the assumptions of its designers. The Zero reflected Japan's beliefs about war and combat, skill, offense, and sacrifice. American fighters reflected a different philosophy, one of industrial power, pilot value, and long-term endurance. Those philosophies clashed in the skies over the Pacific for 4 years. Gradually and inevitably, the one that valued survival triumphed over the one that accepted death as the price of performance. The Zero was brilliant in 1941, outdated by 1943, and suicidal by 1944. Not because Japanese engineers were incompetent, but because Japan's strategy was unsustainable. Today, the legacy of the Akutan Zero lives on in museums, history books, and flight manuals. It remains one of the most important aircraft ever captured, intelligence that helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. The unintended sacrifice of pilot Tadayoshi Koga saved thousands of American lives, shortening the war by months, perhaps years. The Zero itself remains a symbol of the Pacific War's tragedy. A beautiful aircraft that perfectly fulfilled its design goals, yet was doomed by the assumptions behind them. Japanese pilots loved to fly it. American pilots learned to defeat it. Both sides respected it as a masterpiece of lightweight design and a warning against valuing performance over protection. In the end, the lesson is simple. In war, as in life, choices have consequences. Choosing speed over safety costs lives. Choosing agility over strength costs aircraft. Choosing short-term performance over long-term endurance costs victory. The Zero made those choices brilliantly, fatally, deliberately. And on that foggy morning in July 1942, when Lieutenant Albert Knack spotted the red circle through the mist, those choices lay before American engineers to study, understand, and exploit. The abandoned Zero in the Alaskan marsh became a teacher, revealing not just how to defeat a single plane, but how to win an air war. That discovery, more than any single battle, helped ensure America's victory in the Pacific.